opportunity to speak to you. I'm going to keep my comments very short. And what I really want to focus on is a plea to you to do more work on the death penalty and to really talk to you a little bit about the international status of the death penalty and what's happening in the globe on it. There's a paper that's coming around. It's a double-sided page. There might not be enough copies for everybody. I apologize for that. Giving you something of a report on the last United Nations Secretary General's report on the death penalty. Just to give you a background in terms of the death penalty in international human rights law, the death penalty was first identified, the right to life was identified in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. It was then made a key article, Article 6 of the International Convention for the Elimination of International Convention for Civil and Political Rights, and also within that there's an optional protocol on the death penalty, on the abolition of capital punishment. Basically, the right to life is a fundamental human rights, and within the context of international human rights law, there's a real effort made to try and work upon states to abolish the death penalty. I know many of you are doing cases here, and I want to give you some of the arguments that are being used abroad in case they are of assistance. There's still a lot of discussion going on as to why the death penalty should be abolished. I think one of the big reasons that comes up in many cases is that ultimately to use the death penalty is a marker of our civilization. That if we have to resort to punishing people through death, then we as a civilization are failing. That we don't have any other means to bring people to account other than to sentence them to death, and the state taking away the life of an individual. So I think as a marker of civilization, it's really important to push that issue for the abolition of the death penalty. The other aspect, of course, is that if you believe in any human rights at all, and our Constitution here recognizes this very clearly, that every single individual has the inherent right and dignity, and that dignity and right has to be upheld. There's no way that you can uphold that dignity and right if you have the death penalty on your books, and especially if you even use it. So I think the notion that in every single human rights, the right to life is fundamental, and the use of the death penalty violates a very, very basic norm of human rights. Some people argue, of course, that the death penalty should be abolished because of religious motivations. This idea that God can only give life and therefore God can only take life. And again, that has been used in many different jurisdictions with a great deal of effect and has challenged quite a lot of activity. Most recently, it was used in a high court case in Kenya, which resulted in a moratorium on the Kenyan government and finally the abolition of capital punishment in Kenya. But one of the key reasons, of course, is that we can never know for sure that our justice system is foolproof. We heard this morning so many of the problems that exist on legal aid. Well, unless you have complete faith that you are always convicting the right person, you can't ever be sure that you might send an innocent man or woman to their death. And so there are these key reasons really why the activism on the death penalty has to be continued. Now, proponents on the death penalty keep arguing for something that they call the deterrence theory. And this is used a lot in the United States of America, where they say society needs the death penalty as a strong message against crime. That if you know you have the death penalty on your books, then that acts as some kind of a deterrent. It prevents people from committing crime. Frankly, there is very little evidence to back that particular argument. And wherever you look in the criminal justice system, you see that when offenders behave in a particular manner and commit grievous and heinous crimes, they very rarely are even aware of the possibility of a death sentence. And so the extent to which deterrence is relevant is not really very clear. The other argument that's made by proponents for the death penalty is that this is ultimately about victims' rights. That victims have the right to justice, and that if a victim's family is affected by the loss of life, then that victim's family has a right to compensation and even vengeance. I think we need to reiterate that law is not a mechanism for vengeance. It's a mechanism for accountability, and there's a big difference between accountability and vengeance. And of course, the famous Gandhian statement about an eye for an eye and making the whole world blind, I think is key here. The other notion is that this is just desert. Somehow, if you commit the crime, you have to bear the consequence. And if you commit a capital crime, and that particular capital crime attracts a death penalty, then that's just desert. If you've committed the crime, the result is that you have to face the death penalty. Again, there's little evidence really that this has been carried through in many courts of law, that this notion of a just desert again assumes that we can convict beyond any shadow of a doubt an individual and send them to death. Okay, just trends in terms of what's happening globally. So at the moment we have 194 states in the international system at the United Nations level, of which 98 countries have abolished the death penalty. So about half the world's countries, just more than half, have abolished the death penalty. A further 47 countries are essentially what you would call de facto abolished. They've abolished it in fact. They have the death penalty on their books, but they haven't executed in more than 15 or 20 years. So you count that. 98 plus 46. We're up to 150 now. There's 8 countries that only have the death penalty for treason and war crimes. So for the most serious crimes in the world. Work that out now. We're up to 160. That leaves you with about 40 states which are retentionist. And of those 40 states, of course, India is one of them. Within the Commonwealth, there are very few states that actually still retain and use the death penalty. And the countries are not ones to be really proud of, and we should be ashamed to belong to a list of that kind. Countries like, in the Commonwealth, countries like Botswana, Malaysia, Singapore, Pakistan, St. Kitts and Nevis, Uganda, India are the ones that use and retain the death penalty. Outside this group of Commonwealth countries, you have countries like Iran, Iraq, China, who regularly execute people. The question really that we have to ask, I think, ourselves is, as a society that believes in the rule of law and as a society that has constitutional guarantees on human rights, can we afford to belong to a club of countries that don't really serve and don't really even respect human rights to the same extent that we claim to? You know better than I do that there's one thing to make a claim and there's quite another thing to uphold human rights. But there's really a degree of activism that's required to nail this particular death penalty issue. If you look at the trends since 1960 onwards, in every decade there's countries who are stepping up and abolishing the death penalty. Why is it that we haven't got to that stage where we can make these same arguments? And instead, of course, you see a reverse trend here, where there's an increasing trend towards the use of the death penalty, an increasing trend to talking about the death penalty, demanding the death penalty, and even giving judgments on that include the death penalty. So I think this is a moment in time when it's important for lawyers like you who are engaged in your states, especially in the conflict states, to really highlight this fact. And the fact is that the death penalty is barbaric. It's a complete violation of human rights. It's an indication of a failed civilization. If in the end, the only way you can punish perpetrators is to kill them, that means that you've lost the argument anyway. So you've lost the force of argument, and you're now resorting to the argument of force. And this is a terrible indictment of any system that claims to have a constitution and any system that claims to uphold human rights. So I think we need to really focus on this, the fact that the death penalty is barbaric and is a marker of a failed civilization. The other argument you've got to use is that the trend is very clearly towards abolition. So any direction, any attempts made to go against that trend is counter to international trends. The whole of international society is saying the death penalty has to be abolished. It's very clear in public international law that once you abolish the death penalty, you can't bring it back. That's a violation of public international law. So we need to ask ourselves why it is that the death penalty has begun to surface and discussions so much more and really challenge it as and when it arises. The other aspect, of course, is that you have these phenomena, and I know this is the case in India, where you can get stays of execution. Now, in a very famous judgment in 1984 in the European Court of Human Rights, it was decided that death row phenomenon is a form of torture. And the reason for that is that you have this notion by which you don't execute somebody, but you get a stay order on it. And by putting them on a stay order, you put them in the uncertainty that one day they might lose their life. That prospect of putting somebody on death row, as the Americans call it, is actually a form of torture, and torture is absolutely prohibited in public international law. So there's an analogous argument to be made between the use of the death penalty and the effect of the who have a stay of execution, which is akin to a form of torture. So I think if you can use those arguments, that might be quite useful as well. Finally, just to say that I'm happy to answer any questions you might have, but just to say that you can look at the sheet that has come around, and there's a global map there in terms of where states are abolishing the death penalty. It's extremely clear in the Secretary General's report at the United Nations level that this is a trend that's going to continue. Most people predict that the death penalty as a phenomenon in a use of the legal system will disappear by 2025. The question is, at what stage do we want to be in that trend? Do we want to be behind the curve? Do we want to be with the curve? Or do we want to be ahead of the curve? Even in China, which is essentially the country that executes the most number of people, there is a strong movement towards abolition, and there's a strong indicator that the Chinese Communist Party is listening to arguments to abolish the death penalty. Why not in India?